All right, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going really, really small. We're talking semiconductors.
Semiconductor.
You know, these tiny little components that, well, you don't really think about them a lot, but
Right.
they're pretty much the foundation for, well, everything.
Yeah. I mean, everything tech that we use today,
Yeah. Phones, computers,
cars even,
cars,
pretty
yeah.
much anything with a computer in it.
And even some things you wouldn't expect.
Oh, absolutely.
So to help us navigate this kind of invisible world, we're going to be diving deep into Chip War,
Yeah.
the book by Chris Miller.
Great book.
And it's not just about like the tech stuff. It's a
Yeah.
lot more than that. It's about the history, the politics.
The geopolitics.
Yeah, the geopolitics really gets into how all those forces shaped this, well, this pretty vital industry.
Yeah, it's kind of a hidden history in a way.
It is, and it's kind of crazy how much impact these tiny little chips have had.
It's huge.
So today, what we want to do is give you a kind of like a crash course. Yeah.
A way to understand like why these things are so important, where do they even come from,
Right.
and well, what are the big stakes involved?
Because it's not just about the chips themselves.
No, it's about who controls them, who makes them.
Exactly.
So consider this your shortcut.
Your cheat sheet.
Yeah, your cheat sheet to being like totally in the know.
Yeah. Up to speed on one of the most important
Oh, yeah.
global issues today.
So to get started, let's take it back.
Way
Okay.
back in time.
Well, before silicon was even a thing.
Right. Before the Silicon Age.
We're talking like World War II.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
mean, you think about World War II, it's all about this huge, devastating force. Japanese soldiers called it the Typhoon of Steel.
Wow, that's a pretty intense image.
It is. And then after all that destruction, you have this quiet, almost invisible revolution,
Right.
the rise of the Silicon Age.
Just like a total like 180. It is. And it's fascinating to think about some of the key players who emerged from that era.
Yeah, people whose lives were completely shaped by the war.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, take Akio Morita.
Yeah, the Sony guy.
Right. During the war, he was a young engineer working in a Japanese Navy lab.
So he wasn't like on the front lines?
No, but he saw the devastation firsthand.
Wow.
Or think about Andy Grove.
Yeah, the Intel guy.
Right. He went through unimaginable hardship in war-torn Budapest.
I mean, that's a pretty intense backstory.
It is. And those experiences really shaped their views on technology and its potential.
They saw how technology could be used for destruction,
Right.
but also how it could be used to rebuild and create something new.
Exactly. And those early days of computing, there were so many limitations.
Like what kind of limitations?
Or imagine these massive machines filling entire rooms
Oh, yeah, I've seen pictures.
packed with thousands of vacuum tubes.
Oh, those big glowing things.
Right. And they were constantly breaking down.
So not exactly reliable.
No. And they needed constant maintenance. You literally had to debug them.
Debug them, like with actual bugs.
Yeah, moths would get attracted to the heat and cause short circuits.
Wow. So they were big, unreliable, and attracted bugs.
Pretty much. A good example of this is the ENIAC computer.
The ENIC, yeah, I think I've heard of that.
It was built for the U.S. Army during the war.
So a military computer.
Yeah, it could do these complex calculations faster than any human.
That's impressive for that time.
It was, but it was also a huge, clunky machine.
So clearly they needed something better.
Right. Something smaller, faster, more reliable.
Enter the semiconductor.
The semiconductor. This is where things start to get really interesting.
Yeah, this is the heart of the story.
It all starts with William Shockley.
Shockley. Now, he was a bit of a character, right?
He was. Difficult personality, some would say.
Yeah, I've heard that. But he had this amazing understanding of semiconductors.
Oh, absolutely. Brilliant guy. He could, see how electrons behaved in these materials.
Like literally see them.
Well, not literally, but he had this intuitive grasp of the physics.
That's pretty incredible.
It is. And in 1948, he makes a breakthrough. He invents the transistor.
So transistor, this is the big one.
It's basically a tiny little switch, like a valve that controls the flow of electricity.
So instead of those big, clunky vacuum tubes...
You got this tiny, efficient little device.
And it doesn't burn out all the time.
No. It's reliable, it's fast, and it can be made incredibly small.
This is where the miniaturization of everything starts.
Exactly. And the transistor opens up a whole new world of possibilities.
But then things get even more, condensed.
Right. The next big step. The integrated circuit.
The integrated circuit. This
Yeah.
is where multiple transistors get put onto one chip.
Exactly. And this is where things get a little bit competitive.
Oh, how so?
Well, you've got Jack Kilby at Texas Instruments
Texas Instruments.
and Robert Noyce at Fairchild Semiconductor.
Fairchild. Got it.
And they're both working on this idea around the same time.
So it's like a race to see who gets there first.
Kind of.
Ah.
And they both end up contributing to the development of the integrated circuit.
So who wins?
Well, it's not really about winning. They both played a crucial role.
Okay. But what makes the integrated circuit so important?
It's all about miniaturization, cost, and reliability.
Okay, break that down for me.
By putting more and more components onto a single chip,
Right?
you make electronics smaller, cheaper, and much more reliable.
So it's like a win-win-win.
Exactly. And this gets the attention of NASA.
NASA. What do they have to do with it?
Well, they're working on the Apollo program.
Of course, going to the moon.
Right. And they need electronics that are small, lightweight, and super reliable.
Makes sense.
So they start using Fairchild's micrologic chips.
And how did that work out for them?
It was a huge success. These chips performed flawlessly in the harsh environment of space.
Wow. That's a pretty good endorsement.
It was. And it sent the clear signal to other industries. These chips are the future.
So this is like a turning point.
It is. And it's interesting to contrast this with what was happening in the Soviet Union.
Oh yeah, the Cold War is in full swing at this point.
Right. And the Soviets are trying desperately to catch up in the tech race.
But they're having a hard time, right?
Yeah, they're struggling. They're basically trying to copy American technology.
Reverse engineer it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They get their hands on a Texas Instruments chip, the SN51.
Okay.
And they give this directive to Boris Melin, a top engineer.
What's the directive?
Copy it. One for one, no deviations.
Wow. That's a tall order.
It was. And they gave him 3 months to do it.
3 months. That seems a bit ambitious.
It was incredibly ambitious. And it highlights a fundamental misunderstanding.
What do you mean?
They thought that just having the blueprint was enough.
But it's not.
No. Semiconductor manufacturing is incredibly complex.
Right.
There's a ton of tacit knowledge involved, know-how that's not written down anywhere.
So it's not just about the design.
Right. It's about the entire manufacturing process, the materials, the equipment, the experience.
So the Soviets were kind of missing the bigger picture.
They were. And even if they could perfectly replicate a design,
Right.
the technology was advancing so rapidly.
That's Moore's law in action.
Exactly. Every couple of years, the number of transistors on a chip was doubling.
So they were always playing catch up.
Always. And it basically turned their semiconductor industry into a pale imitation of Silicon Valley.
Kind of ironic, isn't it?
It is. Their planned city of science, Zelenograd,
Yeah.
was supposed to be this futuristic tech hub,
Right.
but it ended up being just another node in a global network.
And who's at the center of that network?
American chip makers.
So the Soviets are falling behind, but there's another player emerging.
Japan.
Japan, right? They're about to become a major force in the semiconductor world.
Absolutely. And it's a story that starts with a simple transistor radio.
A transistor radio.
Yeah. In 1962, Japanese Prime Minister Ikeda gives one to Charles de Gaulle.
De Gaulle, the French president.
Right. And he kind of dismisses Ikeda as a transistor salesman.
So he doesn't see Japan as a serious tech threat.
No. He completely underestimates them.
Big mistake.
Huge mistake. Because Japan is about to take the semiconductor world by storm.
And this is where the U.S. kind of plays a part, right?
Yeah, this is interesting. During the Cold War, the U.S. decides to help Japan develop its tech industry.
So they're basically giving their future competitor a boost.
In a way, yes. They see Japan as a key ally against the Soviet Union.
So it's a strategic decision.
Absolutely. They believe a strong Japan is in their best interests.
Does everyone agree with this?
Well, there are definitely some concerns. Some people see the potential for Japan to become a rival.
But the Cold War takes priority.
It does. And Japanese companies are eager to learn and catch up.
And they're willing to do whatever it takes.
Yeah, they're really aggressive, like when Texas Instruments wants to build a plant in Japan.
The first foreign chip maker to do so.
Right, and they run into all these bureaucratic hurdles.
What kind of hurdles?
You know, regulations, permits, all sorts of red tape.
So what do?
They turn to Akio Morita, the Sony guy.
He's like a fixer.
He is. He's got connections. He knows how to navigate the system.
So he helps Texas Instruments get their foot in the door?
He does. He basically tells them to come in quietly, under the radar.
While he smooths things over.
Exactly. The Texans even call Sony a rogue operation.
But they mean it as a compliment.
Oh yeah, they admire their hustle.
So it's this kind of like unlikely partnership.
It is.
Yeah.
And it shows how determined both sides are to succeed.
But back in Silicon Valley, there's a different kind of culture emerging.
Right. It's very focused on efficiency and cost cutting.
And not always in the best way.
No. Some of the practices are pretty controversial.
Like what?
Well, take Charlie Spork at Fairchild.
Okay.
He's a big believer in stock options for employees.
That sounds good.
It is, but he also demands maximum productivity.
So it's like, work hard and you'll be rewarded.
Right. But there's also a lot of pressure to cut costs.
How so?
Well, they start hiring women for lower wages.
Seriously?
Yeah. They argue that women's smaller hands are better for assembling chips.
That's pretty messed up.
It is. And it's a sign of how the industry is starting to prioritize profits over people.
And this cost-cutting mindset leads to another big shift.
Offshoring.
Offshoring. So they're moving jobs overseas.
Right. They realize that labor costs are much lower in places like Hong Kong.
And who's behind this?
Well, Robert Noyce himself had invested in a factory in Hong Kong.
So he sees the potential.
He does. And he encourages others to follow his lead.
And they do.
They do. Fairchild and others start moving their assembly operations overseas.
So the semiconductor industry is becoming increasingly globalized.
It is. And it's driven by both competition and the search for cheaper labor.
But at the same time, semiconductors are becoming increasingly important for another reason.
The military.
The military, right. This is where the chips start to have a real impact on warfare.
Absolutely. The U.S. military is starting to rely more and more on electronics.
But they're having some problems, right?
Yeah, those early guided munitions in Vietnam.
They weren't very effective, were they?
No. They were complex, expensive, and often failed to hit their targets.
So what do they do?
Well, a guy named Weldon Word comes up with a new approach.
Weldon Word, okay.
He decides to build simple, inexpensive, laser-guided bongs.
So instead of these fancy high-tech missiles...
He focuses on something that's cheap and effective.
And it works.
It works amazingly well. They're even able to hit a really tough target. The Thon Hoa Bridge.
The Thon Hoa Bridge. I've heard of that. It was heavily defended.
Yeah, it was. But these laser-guided bombs were able to take it out.
So this is a big moment for military technology.
It is. It shows the power of microelectronics on the battlefield.
And it's not just about bombs.
No. There's another important development happening at Intel.
Okay, what's that?
A guy named Gordon Hoff is looking at a calculator.
A calculator, okay.
And he has this realization.
What is it?
He sees that there's a trade-off between specialized logic circuits and more general-purpose circuits that can be controlled by software.
So instead of designing a chip for every specific task...
You can have a more flexible chip that can do multiple things.
That's pretty brilliant.
It is. And it leads to the development of the microprocessor.
The microprocessor. This is a game changer, right?
It is. It paves the way for the personal computer revolution.
So now we're moving into the 1970s, and the competition in the semiconductor industry is heating up.
It is. And the Pentagon is starting to get worried.
Worried about what?
They're seeing that the U.S. is losing its technological edge.
To who?
The Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And Japan.
So it's a two-front war, in a way.
It is. And within the U.S. chip industry itself, the competition is brutal.
Yeah, I've heard stories.
Charlie Spork at National Semiconductor.
Okay.
He has this famous saying, knock 'em down, fight 'em, kill 'em.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty intense.
It is. That's the kind of mentality they had.
So it's like a war within a war.
It is. And while American companies are fighting each other,
right,
the threat from Japan is growing.
And some people are starting to see it as an economic war.
Exactly. And there's this debate about why Japan is so successful.
Is it government support? Or are they just better?
Well, some American companies like HP,
yeah.
they have data suggesting that Japanese chips are actually higher quality.
So it's not just about cheap labor?
No. They're making really good products.
And this is causing problems for American equipment manufacturers.
Like GCA.
GCA, what do they do?
They make lithography equipment.
Lithography, that's how they print the circuits onto the chips, right?
Right. And GCA is a leader in this field.
But they make a mistake.
They cut ties with Nikon, their lens supplier.
Nikon, the camera company.
The same one. They're also leader in optics.
So GCA loses its best lens supplier.
They do. And their customer service starts to decline.
Not a good combination.
No. And it creates an opening for Nikon.
So Nikon takes over.
They do. They become the dominant player in lithography equipment.
And this is a big deal.
It is. It shows that the U.S. is losing ground in a key area.
And by the mid-1980s, the alarm bells are really ringing.
They are. Japan has overtaken the U.S. in chip production.
And they control the lithography market.
Right. And this raises serious national security concerns.
So what does the U.S. do?
They start to fight back.
How?
Well, the Defense Department takes a really interesting approach.
Okay.
They reach out to industry leaders,
Yeah.
people like Jack Kilby and Robert Noyce.
So they're bringing in the big guns.
They are. They want their help to figure out how to revitalize the U.S. semiconductor industry.
And how do these industry titans respond?
Well, some are eager to help.
But not everyone is on board.
No. Intel, for example.
Intel, okay.
They're kind of hesitant to take government help.
They want to do it on their own.
Right. They're proud of their independence.
But the Pentagon is serious about this.
They are. They form a task force to study the problem.
And what do they find?
Their conclusions are pretty stark. They basically say that the U.S. military is becoming dangerously dependent on foreign chips.
So they're relying on their potential adversaries.
Right. And they're worried that this could undermine their technological superiority.
Makes sense. So what do they recommend?
They recommend that the U.S. government needs to take action to support the domestic chip industry.
And do they?
Well, there's a lot of debate about what to do.
Yeah.
Some people want to protect American companies from foreign competition.
Like with tariffs.
Yeah. Others want to invest in research and development.
So it's a complex issue.
It is. And meanwhile, trade negotiations with Japan are going nowhere.
What's the problem?
Well, the Japanese are very good at protecting their own market.
So they're not making it easy for American companies to sell chips there.
Right. And the negotiations are frustratingly slow. Someone even compares it to peeling an onion.
So it's like there's always another layer.
Exactly. And while the government is trying to figure things out, American companies are struggling to survive.
Like who?
Well, Micron, for example.
Micron. They're still around today, right?
They are. And they were one of the major producers of DRAM chips.
DRAM. That's a type of memory chip, right?
And they're facing intense competition from the Japanese.
So what do?
They go all in on cost cutting.
Really?
Yeah. They create this really intense work environment. Some people describe it as a sweatshop mentality.
Wow. That's pretty harsh.
It is. But they're determined to stay competitive.
So they're fighting fire with fire.
They are. But another company, Intel.
Intel. Okay.
They take a different approach.
What do?
They decide to pivot away from DRAM altogether.
Really? Why?
They realize they can't beat the Japanese at their own game.
So they're looking for a new game?
Exactly. And their CEO, Andy Grove.
Andy Grove, he's a legend in the tech world.
He is. He's a brilliant strategist.
So what does he do?
He completely restructures the company.
What does that mean?
He lays off a quarter of their workforce.
Wow. That's a lot of people.
It is. But he knows it's necessary
They survive.
to survive and to focus on their strengths.
And what are their strengths?
Microprocessors.
The chips that power personal computers.
Right. And Grove has this famous saying, only the paranoid survive.
So he's always looking over his shoulder.
Always. And he's not afraid to make tough decisions.
And it pays off?
It does. Intel becomes the dominant player in the PC market.
So they're basically the kings of the new era of computing.
They are. And meanwhile, on the other side of the world,
Okay.
there's another ambitious player emerging.
Who's that?
Samsung.
Samsung, the Korean company.
Right. They're known for their electronics, but they want to get into chips.
And who's leading the charge?
Lee Byung-chul, the founder of Samsung.
Okay.
He's a very patriotic guy. He wants to make Korea a technological powerhouse.
So it's not just about business for him.
No, it's about national pride.
And he's got a big vision.
He does. He wants Samsung to be a global leader in semiconductors.
And they eventually achieve that, right?
They do. They become one of the biggest chip makers in the world.
So the competition is really heating up, but there's another challenge emerging.
What's that?
The way they're designing chips is becoming a bottleneck.
Right. They're still using manual methods, like pencils and tweezers.
Seriously?
Yeah, it's incredibly time-consuming and error-prone.
So they need a better way.
They do. And two guys, Carver Mead and Lynn Conway,
Okay.
they come up with a solution.
What is it?
They develop standardized chip design methodologies.
What does that mean?
It means they create a system for designing complex chips with millions of transistors.
So it's like a new language for chip design.
Exactly. And it makes the design process much more efficient.
So this is a big step forward.
It is. It paves the way for even more complex and powerful chips.
But not everyone is benefiting from these advancements.
Like who?
The Soviet Union,
Right. They're still struggling to catch up.
despite their best efforts.
Yeah, they're spending a lot of money on espionage.
Trying to steal American secrets.
Right. But even when they get their hands on
They
designs,
can't produce them.
not reliably. They lack the manufacturing
No,
expertise.
they're still dealing with political interference.
Yeah, the KGB is always meddling.
So it's a combination of factors holding them back.
It is. And it's a reminder that technology is about more than just blueprints.
It's about the entire ecosystem, the knowledge, the infrastructure, the culture.
Exactly. And by the early 1990s, the world is changing rapidly.
How so?
The Cold War is ending,
Right.
and there's a new kind of conflict emerging,
The Gulf War.
the Gulf War. And this conflict showcases the power of precision-guided munitions.
The smart bombs we were talking about earlier.
Right. They're used with devastating effectiveness.
And it's a real turning point in military history.
It is. It shows that silicon is now more important than steel.
So it's the triumph of the chip.
It is. And it's also a time of significant change in the industry itself.
How so?
Well, Japan, despite its dominance in memory chips, they missed the boat on the personal computer revolution.
Really? How does that happen?
They're too focused on their existing business.
They don't see the potential of the PC.
They don't. And it costs them dearly.
Because who steps in to fill the void?
American companies like Intel.
So Intel becomes the king of the PC era.
They do. And they ride that wave for years.
But there's another big shift happening in Taiwan.
What's that?
A guy named Morris Chang starts a company called TSMC.
TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company.
Right. And they pioneer a new business model.
The foundry model.
The foundry model. What is that?
Basically, they focus solely on manufacturing chips.
So they don't design their own chips.
No. They make chips that are designed by other companies.
That's an interesting idea.
It is. And it's initially met with a lot of skepticism.
People don't think it will work.
They don't. They think it's too risky.
But Chang believes in it.
He does. And he's proven right.
Because TSMC becomes a giant.
They do. They become the world's largest contract chip maker.
So they're making chips for everyone.
Pretty much. And it changes the entire industry.
So now we've got this new landscape.
Right, with specialized designers and manufacturers.
And it's becoming even more globalized.
It is. And one country in particular is trying to catch up.
China.
China. They have big ambitions.
They want to be self-sufficient in semiconductors.
They do. They don't want to rely on foreign companies.
But they're starting from behind.
They are. They missed out on a lot of the early development.
Because of Mao and the Cultural Revolution?
Right. But they're determined to catch up.
And they're willing to invest heavily.
They are. They pour billions of dollars into their chip industry.
And they're not afraid to copy.
No. They're known for reverse engineering foreign technology.
So it's a mix of legitimate development and some questionable tactics.
It is. And they're making progress.
But they're still facing challenges.
Yeah, they're having trouble mastering the most advanced technologies.
Like EUV lithography.
Right. That's the key to making the most sophisticated chips.
And who controls that technology?
ASML, a Dutch company.
ASML, they're kind of the gatekeeper.
They are. And the U.S. is relying on them heavily.
Even though they're a foreign company.
Right. And it's a bit of a risk.
Because if China were to get their hands on that technology...
It would change the balance of power.
So it's a very strategic situation.
It is. And it's something that the U.S. is very aware of.
And they're taking steps to protect their interests?
They are. They're trying to limit China's access to advanced technology.
Through export controls.
Right. They're making it harder for Chinese companies to buy American chips and equipment.
And how is China responding?
They're not happy about it.
But they don't have a lot of options.
No, they're still dependent on foreign technology.
So it's a kind of stalemate.
For now. But the situation is very fluid.
And the stakes are high.
Incredibly high. The future of global technology is at stake.
And it all comes down to these tiny little chips.
It does. And it's a reminder that we live in a world that's increasingly interconnected.
And where control over technology is a major source of power.
Absolutely. And it's something that we all need to be aware of.
So what can we as individuals do?
Well, we can start by educating ourselves.
Learning about this complex industry.
Right. And understanding the implications.
Then we can support policies that promote innovation and competition.
And that protect our national interests.
Because the future of technology is in our hands.